Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Monte Poker episode 25, quarter of 100. Wow. Cannot believe it. To all the new viewers, welcome. Thank you for stopping by. In this week's episode, we have about 12 to 15 hands to go over. Overall, I feel like we played pretty solid. We may have been over aggressive in some spots and gotten caught once or twice, but if you play a session and don't get caught a couple times, are you really playing poker? Anyhow, this video is a lot shorter than last week's, but we do still make a couple mistakes in my opinion. So get your fingers ready because I'm sure you're ready to blow up the comment section. That's enough of that. Let's get started. All right, the start of this vlog is going to be a little not typical. We bought in for 300, but couldn't really make anything happen. So I'm just going to go through the first set of hands really quickly because they weren't all that interesting, but they're slightly relevant. Started off with king, queen offsuit, and then ended up scooping a small pot. From there, we saw hands for a few hours and got some great starting hands, but they really didn't change our stack size too much. Then during a PLO Bomb Pot, we flopped 2-pair with an open-ended straight, but did not get there and lost. We saw some more great hands and we were hitting pairs, 2 pairs, sets, and straights, but getting absolutely zero action. So eventually I got fed up that we weren't able to make money with our good hands. So I tried to make money with our marginal hands and just ended up running a triple barrel bluff into someone who flopped top 2, lost half of my starting set. After that, I got it all in with ace jack on a jack high board versus someone that had a diamond draw. We'd let him get there for too cheap and ended up paying him off on the river. So at this point, it was time for us to reload and we rebought for another $500. And this is where the real poker begins. Let's dive in. So as I mentioned, we were pretty card dead for the start. We started a session at 2. It's now 4:34. We look down at 2 6s with a deuce 3 of diamonds. The board comes out 10, 5, 6 rainbow. So we have middle set. It's not the nuts, but it's a pretty decent hand. So I lead out here for $30. For those that are watching for the first time at this establishment, anytime there is a dealer change, we play a PLO Bomb Pot, but it is capped at $100 as to not break the hold'em game. Because as you know, for the PLO players, these pots can get quite out of hand very quickly. Also worth mentioning, we do have a gut shot straight draw, so any 4 would give us a straight, and we do have a backdoor diamond draw. Not that we're playing for any of those hands, but I do think it is worth mentioning. 4 players called our bets. There's 190 in the middle, and we go off to the turn, which comes a 4 of spades. Now, we don't have the best possible straight. We are losing to 7-8, but a straight is still a strong hand, and we have a set to go along with it. So if the board pairs, we will have a full house. So I decided to bet the rest of the limit, which is $60 here. One of our opponent goes into the tank for a little bit, but eventually does put in the call. Player in the middle ends up folding, and the player on the button puts in the call as well. So we go 3 ways to this river here, which brings the 9 of hearts, which honestly doesn't change much because we were already losing to 7-8. 7-8 just makes a bigger straight now. The dealer shows our set of 6s and then realizes we have a straight, so she announces a straight. Our villains show their hand, and it somehow is the best possible hand here, so we end up scooping this $370 bomb pot. Winning a pot is fun, but the game is much more fun to me when you can play for stacks. We look down at ace 3 of clubs, under the gun +1. There's been a lot of raising lately, so I just limp for $3 here, expecting somebody to raise, and almost immediately the pot gets bumped up to $20. When 3 more players put in the call, we're absolutely not going anywhere with this hand here, so we also put in the call. Going 5 ways to this flop here, the board runs out ace 5-8 rainbow. We hit a pair of aces, but I don't expect it to be good with a 3 kicker very often, so when the action checks to me, I just go ahead and check it over to the pre-flop aggressor. He decides to continue here for $60. Everybody else very quickly gets out of the way, but when the action gets back over to me, I decide to put in the call here. Now, why am I putting in the call when I just said our kicker is no good? The player to my left seems pretty solid. In a pot this size, since he was the pre-flop aggressor, that ace is going to hit his range a lot of the time. But since the action got checked to him, it's entirely possible that he is just making a continuation bet on this flop with any pocket pair like 9s, 10s, or jacks. So we put in the call here with plans to lead on the turn. The 9 of diamonds peels off and it doesn't change too much on this board. Decide to fire here for $80, which is about a third of the pot. This should be big enough to get a pair below the aces to fold, and if our opponent does have a big ace, he will most likely put in a raise because that 9 of diamonds brought in 2 draws and he doesn't want to see a river card for cheap. So our opponent does in fact put in a raise. It's a little under 200. I tell him that it smells like ace king and throw my cards in the middle, and he's nice enough to show ace queen suited. Might have been a bit of an ambitious play on our part, but hitting top pair in poker is more difficult than you would think. So we definitely don't want to give pots away too easily when we have top pair on an uncoordinated board. A few minutes go by and we look down at 9-10 offsuit in the small blind. There was a straddle for $10 under the gun, so we decide to put in the call here when one player calls in the middle, and then the villain from the previous hand that took us for a good amount ends up putting in a raise to $40. This is probably why you shouldn't call with 9-10 offsuit, especially out of position. It's not that great of a hand to be playing in general, but especially out of position. If it were suited and in position, it's a bit of an easier decision. And then the 2 players after the big blind end up making the call, so now I feel a little stuck. I kind of just want to muck this hand now, but we're getting great odds. It's $30 more to make a pot of 160. Obviously I'm grabbing chips, so we are going to put in the call here, kicking myself for calling the additional $9 and not just folding, but hopefully we can smash this flop here. 160 in the middle, and the board comes out for 8-10 rainbow. We hit top pair and have a marginal kicker, so I'm gonna bet for a good amount here. I throw in $80 for a half pot size bet, and almost immediately the opponent to our left goes all in. So I was putting him on a big ace like ace queen or ace king like the last hand, but that is not the story he is telling with this bet sizing. He is representing a big pocket pair, so at this point I think it's a pretty easy decision. We're just gonna go ahead and fold. The second my cards hit the muck, he flips over pocket kings. The other villain, who is all in for $70, shows the Brunson, good old 10 deuce, flop top pair, but in need of some serious help here, so they go to this run out. 7 of diamonds on the turn gives him a flush draw, but the ace of spades on the river seals his fate. Pocket kings hold this time, and our nemesis for the day scoops yet another pot. Our stack was a little short after this, so we swapped our greens for some reds and then added on another 300, swapped them for some more reds with Margot, and now we have a bit more of an intimidating stack to get involved with. This next hand happens at 5-16. There is a limp by the under the gun player, and then the cutoff ends up betting $15. I look down at ace king suited, definitely going to put in a raise here because we don't want to go 4 ways to this flop, so I make it $40 to go. I chose this bet sizing in hopes that the cutoff would put in a call, but the other player that limped in for 3 gets out of the way. That doesn't seem to be the case though, because if it's good for 3, it's good for 40, am I right? So the action gets back over to the cutoff. He grabs some chips, throws them in the middle, and we go 3 ways to this flop. Playing for 123, and the board comes out king 7 king with 2 clubs. Absolutely phenomenal flop for our hand. We flop trips with top kicker. We're not going to slow play this because there is a flush draw out there, and we're also out of position, so I don't want to let this check through. I decided to fire out here for $50, which was a little bit under half pot. This should be the right amount to keep any flush draw interested, and obviously any other king isn't gonna go anywhere. So the first villain puts in the call. Remember, he limped in for $3 but then called 40, so he could have realistically any 2 cards here. And that's when something interesting happens. The action gets over to the cutoff and he goes all in. I was gonna put in the snap call, and that's when I realized the player behind me actually had me covered, so I decided to go all in instead. The other villain decides to muck his hand, so we go heads up to this run out. The turn comes a 6 of spades, which doesn't change anything, and the river is a 3 of diamonds. I show our 3 kings with an ace and 7 kicker. Our opponent takes a quick peek at his hand and slides it towards the dealer, indicating that we win this one, and this $645 pot is coming our way. Playing 1, 3, 10, 20 in this next hand here. Yes, you heard that correctly, ladies and gentlemen. There is a double straddle on for $20 here. We're under the gun, so we already have $10 in there. When a few players call, we we go ahead and put in the call here with 6-7 offsuit. It's a little wider than I like to call with, but since we already had $10 in there and it's only 10 more with only one player behind, you know, it just made sense to me at the time. Unfortunately, the player that is last to act, who straddled for $20, ends up re-raising it to 60. I do expect him to be doing this with a very wide range, considering he is last to act and everybody else just limped in for 20 and didn't raise themselves, so everybody else on the table looks pretty weak. So when he goes for this squeeze play, I'm not necessarily too intimidated. I do think we might have live cards. And then when two players put in the call behind him, it's a pretty no-brainer call here. Once again, I would not recommend playing 6-7 offsuit for this amount of money pre-flop, but given how the action went and the fact that there was a double straddle and we were priced in to see the flop both times, it's very hard to get away from it. Anyhow, go into this flop four ways, $243 in the middle. The board runs out 2-10-7 with 2 spades. We hit the board, but obviously it's nothing impressive because we just have a 7 with a 6 kicker. But what could our opponents have in this situation given the action? Pocket deuces would make sense to just limp call pre-flop. I think pocket 7s with the amount of dead money in the middle probably would have raised. Pocket 10s definitely would have raised, and ace 10, depending on the player in position, may have been a raise or a call. So I think we're ahead of a ton of other hands that contain 2 Broadway cards and other suited connectors that didn't hit this board. The only thing that I'm really concerned with is the player to our left having a big pocket pair again, but he easily could have been making that move with ace king or ace queen. So for all those reasons, I do decide to lead out here with our pair of 7s. I try to grab 120, but end up grabbing 105. I was going for about a half pot size bet, but this is still close enough, so we're a little bit under. Our nemesis goes into the tank for about a minute, but ultimately does elect to fold, and then the other players pretty quickly put in the fold after that. We were very fortunate to have hit the board and been the first ones to act, because I'm okay making that move with the pair of 7s, but not okay calling if somebody else would have bet first. About 2 hours go by and we look down at king deuce of spades. Why is king deuce of spades on the vlog, you might ask? Well, that's because not a single person wanted to raise. So the action got back to me. I normally wouldn't raise this hand. I felt like I should raise this hand and not play it 4 ways and just take down the dead money that's in there, but I decided to check my option. I think I was eating at the time, but whatever, it happens. There's a whopping $12 in this pot before the floor takes their rake and the board comes out 5 king 6 rainbow. I do have top pair, but I decided to check my option for some reason. Once again, I think I was eating and not paying too much attention. When our opponent decides to bet $15, the action gets back over to the small blind, who for some reason is tanking for this tiny decision. Takes a second peek at his hand and then eventually throws it away. I say 15 is enough to see a second card, and then the opponent to my left also calls. So 3 of us going to this turn, which comes a 7 of diamonds. This card is typically going to connect better with the blinds than it will anybody else on the table, although we all limped, so it's not really like we're playing, you know, any defined ranges. I decided to fire for 40 here. We lose the player in the middle, and then the original flop better decides to put in a quick call. 137 now in the middle, going off to this river card, which comes in 8 of clubs. Once again, in my head at the time, I was still playing range v range, not necessarily saying that was correct at this particular moment, considering there was no race pre-flop. Anyhow, I decided to continue firing here for $110, which was pretty close to pot. It's about 80%, basically telling my opponent that I have a straight or nothing. The villain in this hand is a thinking player, and I know he pays attention to these small details. So I tried to size my bet as if I was going for value with the straight. If I would have gone over the pot, it might have looked too much like a bluff and he may have snap called it, thinking I was just trying to steal the pot from him. But if I would have gone for a smaller bet sizing, anywhere between $40-$60, he would have had to have called with most of his single pair or 2 pair hands for that price. Our opponent thought about it for quite a few minutes, but eventually he did cut out some chips and throw them into the middle.
All right, what do we got?
Probably good. I just have a king. So unfortunately, we did not get that one through. A bit crazy that we ended up playing a $357 pot when we limped in for $3, but I do think that we played that one pretty well. And given how long it took our opponent to make the decision and the fact that he almost folded, can't be too upset with the situation. After being card dead for a few hours, we finally look down at a premium ace queen offsuit, and we're in the cutoff. Always better to have these great hands in later position, definitely makes them easier to play. There is an open for $15 by the under the gun player. I don't want the limpers to come along by just flatting, so I put in a re-raise to $35 here, trying to isolate. The button quickly folds, the small blind folds, the big blind folds, and then you guessed it, the camera folds as well. But we're not going to let the camera fold. We need to capture this action. So when the action gets back to the under the gun +1 player, he puts in the call. So we're going to go heads up to this flop here. $74 in the middle, and the board runs out 6-5 jack with 2 spades. Our opponent checks it over to us, and I think we should be continuing with a big portion of our range here, but considering we're holding the ace of spades, I'm not putting our opponent on the spade draw. And if he had a hand like ace jack or jack 10, I would expect him to lead out on this board. For those reasons, I decided to mix it up and just check this back here. And then the queen of diamonds peels off on the turn. Our opponent takes a quick peek at his hand, but then checks it over to us one more time. There's no way we're going to check back on this card. We actually have a pair now, but I don't want to bet too big and scare him off, so I decided to go for about a third, which is $25. Our opponent thinks it over for about 30 seconds and then eventually puts in the check raise to $75. We're obviously not folding for this amount, but now I'm a bit confused. I don't think he'd do this with king queen, and if he had queen jack, I'd expect him to bet the flop. Put in the call because we're curious, so we go off to this river with 224 in the middle, and the 10 of hearts peels off. I'm not sure what our opponent check raised us on the turn. This card could be 100% irrelevant, but if he was trying to turn his hand like a jack 10 or a queen 10 into a bluff, knowing I had a bigger kicker, he just got there on us. And with the amount of time that our opponent spends tanking, along with the old stare at my chips and sigh routine he's trying to pull, I am fairly certain that we are behind. I just don't know if we were behind from the get-go or if this 10 absolutely killed us. A minute or so later, our opponent decides to fire out for $120, and now the action is back to me, and I'm really annoyed. Mostly because I believe that we had the better hand on the flop and the turn, and our opponent just totally sucked out on us on the river. Normally in these spots, when I know I'm behind and I spot a physical tell that confirms that we're behind, I can just let the hand go, but my ego got to me a little bit and I just had to know what our opponent had. So we put in the call.
Straight.
Kidding me, dude. I knew I was a bad river. So obviously we should have just folded on that river bet. Turn bet, I think we were okay calling and seeing one more street, but once the 10 got there and it looked like our opponent very clearly liked it, we should have thrown it away. Was not expecting him to show ace king there. Our opponent was drawing to 7 outs, and unfortunately he hit one. All right, about 15 minutes go by and we get a shot at redemption. There's a $10 straddle, and the villain from the last hand flats under the gun. The action then folds over to me, and we're not just gonna play for $10 here. I'm gonna bump it up to 40. I don't want the blinds to call here, but I want the under the gun player to call, obviously. We have a great starting hand and we're in position, but unfortunately our $40 bet was not enough for the button, who already had $10 invested into the pot, to go away. But luckily this just makes it far more likely that the under the gun player will put in the call, which he does. $124 in the middle, and we go to this board that comes out 6-5-6 rainbow. I don't expect this board to hit our opponent's range very often. I'm definitely going to continue betting here. Don't want to play it timid like we did the last hand, so I'm going to go for a 2/3 pot size bet here. $80 going into the middle, bringing up our total to 204. Our opponent doesn't think about it for very long before putting in the call, so I'm not really sure what he has here, where he's not afraid of this board texture. Queen of clubs hits the turn. Our opponent snap checks. I have less than a pot size bet, so I'm just going to go ahead and get it in the middle here. If our opponent has a queen, so be it, but that doesn't seem to be the case when he returns his cards to the dealer, and we scoop this $500 pot. Ace queen did us dirty earlier today, but this time we look down at ace queen suited, so hopefully it goes a bit better this time. There's a limp for $3, an open for $10 in middle position, a flat for $10, and then Margot on the button decides to raise for $50. Normally I would fold ace queen off, but ace queen suited with some potential callers behind us I think is worth at least seeing a flop, even though I do feel like Margot's going to have a big pair a lot of these times, or ace king herself. Steve puts in the call, action gets back down to to the other end of the table, and the second Steve puts in the call, and then we have one more caller. So just like that, we are playing for a $250 pot. And to make things better, we absolutely smashed the flop with an 8 Queen 5 board. With this much money in the middle, there are no plans to solo play on my part, especially with 2 diamonds out there. So I decided to bet $100 into 250. It was a little more than 30% of the pot, and I'm trying to get somebody with the flush draw to have the right odds to chase their flush here. But it's big enough to get somebody off of a hand like ace king, unless obviously they're holding diamonds. And to my surprise, one of our opponents decides to go all in for $246. The action gets over to Margot, and she does not look too pleased at this action. I'm thinking she might have a hand like pocket jacks or ace king, and she obviously can't continue on this board. She gets out of the way, and we obviously put in the call for $143 more. Can't go anywhere with top. Hoping to see black cards. The king of clubs comes on the turn. 5 of clubs hits the river. We show ace queen, and our opponent shows 6-7 offsuit. He flopped an open-ended straight draw and unfortunately did not improve. But fortunately for us, that means this pot is heading our way. And perfectly timed, right after we win a big hand, we look down at pocket jacks. There is a $10 open from the under the gun player. I raised to 35 bucks. The button calls behind us for 35 bucks. And when the action gets back over to the small blind, he thinks it over for quite a bit here before putting in a raise to $75. The big blind folds, the under the gun player folds, and now the action is back on me. The table dynamic had changed significantly since earlier. There was definitely a lot more action and people were 3-betting very light. I put our opponent on 2 Broadway cards, probably ace king or ace queen, most likely suited. For those reasons, I decided to jam in this spot. I have a strong pocket pair, but I was honestly trying to represent either aces or kings with this bet sizing. We have an opponent behind us that has about 500 behind, and the opponent right after him has a little under that. I really don't want to have to play with the button involved because I'd be out of position, and if any Broadway card hits the board, I'm probably going to be in trouble, and I think we're dominating the small blind. The button goes into the tank for well over 3 minutes. He says he really doesn't want to fold this hand, and that it would just be way too nitty to fold this hand, and that he doesn't even want to tell us what he's considering laying down right now. Feels like pocket queens to me, ladies and gentlemen. He eventually does decide to throw it away. The small blind snap calls, which we were expecting, but what I wasn't expecting was for him to flip over pocket aces. 757 in the middle, the board comes 6 deuce 7, turn is a 9 of spades, and the river is a king of hearts. We got absolutely destroyed here, had a totally awful read in this situation. The villain had been calling light all night, but I don't think he actually ever mid-clicked anybody. I just got excited when I had a really good hand against a player that had been playing a little bit loose all night and thought I was going to go for the maximum here. Should have maybe taken a little bit longer to decide, and I might have been able to figure it out. But honestly, the way this player had been playing, I probably would have done the same thing even if I had thought about it longer. It's just so hard to put an opponent that's playing everything on a strong hand. Some time goes by and eventually we get a hand worth playing. It looks like we're calling a $10 straddle, but not sure what's what yet. Apparently it's queen 10 suited. Pretty solid hand. If I had a bigger chip stack and we hadn't just lost a massive pot, I may have even raised it from this position, but we're playing a little timid right now. The big blind isn't playing as timid though. He decides to raise it up here. There's a caller behind him, so we are now priced in to make the call as well, because I assume the button is going to come along after I call, and that does happen to be the case. So we go off to this flop here 3 ways, 161 in the middle, and the board runs out 6 deuce jack with 2 spades. We have the front door spades with the back door straight draw, and we're definitely going to bet here, but I don't want to go too big. I'm just going to put in a quarter pot size bet here for $40. This is mostly just a pot builder. 2 of our opponents check, so I don't expect him to have hit this board a lot of the time. But to my surprise, the big blind check raises us to 120. Now I'm a bit confused, but I'm going to put in the call very quickly here. Don't want to show any sort of fear or tank like we're on some sort of draw. I want to make it seem like we have a big hand and we're not afraid to play for our entire stacks here. At this point, I have less than a pot size bet left, slightly under 400 in my stack. So if our opponent checks this turn, we're definitely going to jam. And when the 8 of hearts comes on the turn, this now gives us a gut shot to go along with our flush draw. Our opponent does not check though. He does decide to fire here, but he only bets 150. 150 into 400 just seems really weak. Feels like a single pair hand that's just trying to get to a cheap showdown. It also doesn't seem like it's trying to protect against the flush either, so I guess he could also have 2 spades in this situation. I'm not really sure, to be honest, but what I am sure of is if he had a good hand, he would have bet a lot bigger than this. So I decide to snap shove on him. And almost as quickly as I go all in, our opponent folds, meaning our read was most likely right. Considering how much we had behind and how much he had put in there, it was only going to cost him another 215 to 220 to make that call to win a pot that was getting pretty close to $1,200. But based on how quickly our opponent folded, he may have just had ace high in that situation. Unfortunately for him, he didn't know that ace high is good. Unfortunately for him, he doesn't know that ace high was actually good on this turn. And that, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of our session. It was a fun session. Our stack was all over the place, very similar to the last vlog we put out, but you know, that's how poker goes sometimes. Luckily, we were able to make some of it back this time. That doesn't always happen, as you guys have seen in the past. Sometimes you just leave stuck a bunch of money and you have to wait until the next time you hit the felt to try and make it back. Fortunately, we were able to minimize our losses this time, which goes a very long way when you're trying to build a bankroll. There may have been some hands that we could have gotten away from tonight, but overall, I don't think we played too bad. We didn't put ourselves in awful situations. We tried to bluff at a few pots, got caught in some of them, got some through, and that helped us get us paid when we actually had decent hands as well. Still definitely learning, still trying to work on my bet sizing, so feel free to drop any pointers you guys have to offer in the comments as per usual, or if you just want to roast my donkey plays, go for it. I don't really care. Got a little sensitive about it last week, but then the general manager over at Outlaws left the funniest comment in the world. I'll throw it up on the screen for you now. And this just made me get over it instantly because he's absolutely right. As far as the session updates, I'll throw that up now. We bought in for 1,200 even, cashed out 1087 after tip, so a loss of $113, but it could have been worse. And our overall graph is still showing that we have a total profit of $9,386. Not bad for a 1-3 player. Thank you guys for stopping by, and I will see you all next week. Take care.